Hi there, my name is Jendi Kersey, and today we're going to talk about crisis communication in a post-COVID world. COVID-19 has been a cautionary tale. It has been a brutal health crisis, and it has also been a public relations crisis for many. It has really illustrated the difficulty of communicating in unfamiliar roles using unfamiliar tools. The question is, why did some organizations and educational agencies do better than others? And my answer would be that they used the tenets of good crisis communication. So today, we're going to learn all about those. The goals are to learn the essentials of crisis communication and also to make a plan to make a plan. While I would love to tell you that in the next hour or so, you're going to have a comprehensive crisis communication plan done, that is not the case. However, we will talk about everything you need to know to create a comprehensive crisis communication plan for the various crises you're likely to face. So why bother putting in the time? I think if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that we are sure to be facing crises. The question is when and where and what type. So you have two choices. You can wing it, and that approach usually means your legal fees will skyrocket and your relationships will crumble. Or you can prepare, which means that you step out, putting your values first, saying what you mean to say, and communicating with all of the stakeholders you want to reach. I realize I'm biased, but I go with option two. Good crisis communication can do three things. It can maximize people's safety. It can help safeguard your agency's reputation, and it can reduce the impact of the crisis on your financial position. Three very good reasons to do some planning in my book. So let's get to it. What are the crises you're most likely to face? In education, they basically fall into two buckets. There are external crises that will affect you, and then there are internal crises. On the external side, you have natural disasters and societal disasters. So when I'm referring to natural disasters, it's things like tornadoes and floods and wildfires and hurricanes. And anybody who lives in a region where those are common pretty much knows the drill. You know about when they're going to happen during the year, usually, and you kind of know what's going to happen. Obviously, you don't know the details, the date, the time, how it's going to start, but you know a lot. Societal disasters, I would argue, are a little harder to plan for, but they include things like civil unrest or a terrorist threat or like an infrastructure disaster. So while they might not originate within your educational community, they can have an enormous impact on it. The kinds of crises that are centered more around your educational community are things like tragedies involving students or staff. So this could be a student committing suicide or a beloved staff member getting a catastrophic health diagnosis. These are the sorts of tragedies that have an enormous impact very directly on your stakeholders. Other types of insider, if you will, crises are things like malfeasance, including staff and students. So maybe an inappropriate relationship between a staff member and a student, or mismanagement, financial or operational mismanagement or fraud, that sort of thing. So those, while you don't like to think about it, you probably can imagine what those would be. The last kind of crisis is a crisis born of misinformation. So while the content might not seem true or real or seem like a disaster, the public relations fallout can be disastrous. So these are the 5 most common types of crises in education. So what we're going to do today is to go through the 8 steps in how to plan for a crisis and communicate through it. And then, so I'll list all of the steps, and then I will also get into each one in detail. Just so that you know, I will make this presentation available as well as a workbook because I feel like if you go through and you do the planning ahead of time, it's helpful to have a step-by-step guide. All right, Crisis Communication 101. Step number 1 is to gather your team and gather the facts. I put those as a single step because they are equally important and have to be done before anything else. Step number 2 is to identify your stakeholders. These are all the people that you want to communicate with, okay? Identifying your partners is number 3. So these are folks that you will be working with, certainly in a communicative area, like with communication. Partners in a school shooting situation, for example, could be law enforcement. Partners in a natural disaster might be firefighters or medical first responders. Those are partners. Step 4 is to develop your messages. And as strange as this sounds, you can develop the bulk of your messages before any crisis ever hits. Step 5 is to identify your communication channels. And so when I say channels, I mean, are you communicating via traditional media, social media, email? Are you putting things up on your website? Are you communicating with local radio stations? Are you using paid advertising? Like, what are you doing to communicate? Those are your different channels. Also, who might serve as a spokesperson for you, not your official spokesperson, but maybe people in the faith community or the health community or the law enforcement community who can be your partners in communicating your message. So those are all the different channels. Step 6 is to create a timeline. I understand that when a crisis hits, there are things you get to choose when it comes to revealing information and things that sort of just happen to you. So to the degree that you can, you'll want to create a timeline. Step 7 is to execute your plan and use the tools that make it really hard to leave something out. And then step 8 is to review key learnings. It's a step lots of folks skip to their detriment. Right after a crisis has finished, you are going to be the most aware and emotionally invested in never making those mistakes again. So it's an important step. Even before step 1, and regardless of the type of crisis that you face, it is incredibly important to lead with your values. So for me, every single time I have ever worked with an education client, they have put the value, the top priority value, as the physical and emotional safety of students. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a pandemic, a school shooter, a terrorist threat, a staff member embezzling funds. It is always about the physical and emotional safety of students. We'll get into a little bit more how you use your values when it comes to messaging. So actually, we'll do it right now. So if your number one goal is to protect the physical and emotional safety of students, that there are other values that you can use as you start to develop your messaging and do your planning. So let's say that malfeasance is the type of crisis that you're dealing with. Let's say that one of your staff members has been accused of fraud of some sort. The kinds of values that your organization holds are going to be the lens through which you see this crisis and that you want others to see this crisis. So if it's malfeasance, you may say things like, people are innocent until proven guilty. You may also want to let folks know that you are working in full cooperation with local law enforcement. And you may want to mention that that person is on administrative leave because protecting students is the single most important thing. So you are not making assumptions about this person's guilt, and you're not giving this person an opportunity to do further damage if he or she is in fact guilty. So that's what I mean by value statements. You don't have to know the specific crisis or the details of a specific situation in order to lead with your values. Okay, so let's really get into the nitty-gritty now. Step one of any crisis is to gather your team and gather the facts. As I go through each one of these steps, I'm going to share what I would do if you're in the wonderful situation of simply preparing for an imagined crisis, and then what you do if you're actually in the midst of a crisis. So, gathering your team and gathering the facts. The primary members of your communication team should be your agency's leader, your public information officer, and legal counsel. If you have those three people, you have a communication team. Ideally, you have some additional folks because while you don't want the group to be too big, you absolutely want the perspective of seasoned leaders who maybe represent different groups, different ideas, different perspectives. So, members of your senior leadership team, maybe you want your CBO because they're going to let you know or help you remember what things cost. Maybe your HR director because you want to be thinking about what the legal ramifications are of certain actions when it comes to employees or how to safeguard employees in some way, shape, or form. You get the idea. And occasionally, you'll want to have folks that are not within your organization. So if you need expertise in a certain area, you may invite others into your communication team. Few things about this. If you have a PIO as a public information officer, if your public information officer has no experience dealing with crises and you face a crisis, I highly recommend getting some help, finding a communications professional that can walk you through the process. Your PIO can learn from that person so that they're ready next time, and you won't make the sorts of mistakes that can negatively affect, again, the safety, reputation, and finances of your organization. The other thing to remember in that core team I mentioned is that you're going to have both legal counsel and a communications professional. Both are focused on limiting liability, but they sometimes do it differently. So a lawyer is as risk averse a person as you could hope to find, and thank heaven for them. What I always defer to legal counsel on are matters that are either clearly black and white. This is legal or illegal. You can do this or you cannot do this, right? So that's really important. Sometimes where I differ with some of my colleagues in the legal profession is what kinds of behaviors are likely to mitigate risk. From a legal standpoint, oftentimes they'll recommend you never say, "I'm sorry," because that is an admission or can be construed as an admission of guilt. Whereas from my perspective, there are times in a crisis where a heartfelt apology can completely diffuse a situation. When all people really need is to hear that you take responsibility for what happened and you're doing everything in your power to make sure it doesn't happen again. So be aware that it's important to have strong and experienced people in both of those roles. Again, speaking of pre-crisis or during the crisis. So if you're preparing for a crisis, it's great to get your core team together or even a slightly larger team, maybe with some school board members or other members of your senior leadership team to go through those crisis categories that we talked about and try to imagine what are the most likely crises you'll face and to go through the steps that we're about to go through here and make a plan for each of those types of crises. You can even do as much as writing a press release. And I know you're maybe thinking that's crazy. I have no details of what crisis might hit, but you have more than you think you do. And if you've done a lot of the work up front, then when the crisis hits, you can focus on those details rather than being scrambled and looking for people's contact information and trying to figure out what to say. So if you're in preparation mode, think through each crisis and your response to it. If you are not, then you need to choose your spokesperson for this crisis, and you need to gather your team and start verifying the facts, making sure that you understand the source of the information and doing everything you can to corroborate it before you go out and start spreading rumors inadvertently. Also, it's really important to make sure that you're not responding with a knee-jerk reaction. If somebody comes and says to you, I believe one of your teachers is having sex with one of your students, you might be so horrified by the idea that you assume guilt. Not a good response. So you really want to make sure that you don't sacrifice accuracy for speed of response. You want to verify the facts to the degree that you can. Step 2, identifying your stakeholders. So to define stakeholders, these are really the groups of people that you want to communicate if there's ever a crisis. In education, this is students and their families, your employees, your school board members, your community leaders, members of the media. This is obviously not an exhaustive list, but these are the sorts of groups that you want to be thinking about. And it's great to start with big buckets, but then you want to start getting more granular, because when it comes to crisis communication, it is really important not to think about people in these big buckets, but to start to think about who is going to be difficult to communicate with and why, and making a plan to reach those people. So if your primary language isn't English, it can be very difficult to get the information you need in a crisis, right? So when you start thinking about your stakeholders, what other languages should the communications come out in? And not only language, but what are the cultural norms around the folks that may not have English as a primary language? Just doing a straight translation from English to another language is better than not doing the translation. But having a bilingual, bicultural approach is far more effective. Other sorts of barriers to communication can be access to electronic devices. I'm thinking about maybe your homeless or foster students. I'm thinking about your students in poverty. If you're assuming that everybody's got a smartphone and a computer, you'll be right that most folks do, but not everyone. How else can you communicate with folks, especially when a crisis hits? Also, trusted sources of information. So who gets their information from word of mouth, from friends, from relatives, from maybe health information? They trust their doctor. Maybe when it comes to social information, they trust their faith leader. Be thinking about who your stakeholders get information from, who they trust, because those are the people you're going to want to enlist in helping you get your communication, your messages out. And ADA compliance is essential. You want to make sure that your website is ADA compliant, and you want to be thinking about folks who are hard of hearing, blind, wheelchair bound. Not that that matters so much for communication, but for where you're putting information. Is it easy to get to? So identifying your stakeholders is more than just thinking, oh yeah, my students, my staff, the media, done. No. Once you've identified these stakeholders, you want to build trust with them. So again, if you're in preparation mode, this is great. You have time to build relationships and build trust. And you have time to gather accurate communication information. If, on the other hand, you're in the middle of a crisis, you don't have a lot of time to build that trust. All you can do is put out really solid information and to think through as quickly as you can who can be your partners in sharing that information. Which takes me to number 3, which is identifying those partners. So the partners are the people that you'll work with to address the crisis and to coordinate with on communication. This could be law enforcement or other local government agencies. In the case of a school shooter, definitely it would be law enforcement. In the case of a pandemic, it would be your local public health department. And potentially pediatricians and others. If you've got a natural disaster, you may want to be connecting with state and local elected officials, because they're typically connected in with all sorts of different groups. So as you think about who your partners might be, it's easier to come up with them when you go through those types of crises that you may face. Who would you connect with if there were a hurricane? Who would you connect with if one of your staff members had been accused of illegal activity? Once you start getting into the details, it's fairly straightforward to think of who those partners might be. And it's a lot easier to come up with them when you're not in the middle of a crisis. So again, you want to build your relationships early, because relationships and trust don't happen overnight. When it comes to partners, one thing that you may consider is learning the incident command system. This is a system that is used by law enforcement and first responders in the midst of a crisis. I think it was developed by the military, but basically it allows everybody to use common terms, and it has pre-established roles. So if you're trying to connect with other agencies that use the incident command system, it can be really useful to understand the nomenclature. And I've got an example of those roles in my workbook that I'm happy to provide as a free download on my website. If you don't have an existing relationship with these partners, as you start to identify who they are, do you know their cell phones? Do you have their emails? Could you get in touch in short order? One of the things that tends to happen when it comes to crises is they aren't really convenient. They happen in the middle of the night, they happen after office hours, they happen on the weekends. So having a good list of how to communicate is really helpful, and sometimes hard to do in the middle of a crisis. So one thing that can be very helpful in developing partnerships is to do tabletop drills. You get a bunch of folks at a table, maybe once a quarter or maybe twice a year, and you run through scenarios that are likely to happen in your region. This is great for planning. It's also great for networking and building those relationships. So if that's not already happening where you are, maybe you could be the catalyst to get those going. Okay, developing messages. So as I said, most messages can be developed ahead of time. When it comes to developing messages, the questions you need to answer or the ideas you need to consider are these. Who is affected by this crisis and how? What information you share with each of your stakeholders to increase their safety, maintain your good reputation, and minimize the negative financial impact of this crisis. And remember that you're dealing with humans here, right? So you want to answer the questions that you would have if you were them. Like, first of all, make sure that you don't skip steps, that you very clearly outline the who, what, why, when, where, and how of the situation. And then think about what's most important in this situation. So example, let's say there's a wildfire. People would need to know that school is closed so they don't send their kids there. They would need maybe to know that your high school is serving as the local shelter so that they know where to find shelter. They would also need to know where, when, and how to get information, because with many natural disasters, it is a quick moving crisis and there's a lot of information. So if you let folks know, CAL FIRE is going to be giving daily updates at 3 o'clock, then they know. They're going to be giving them at the library, so you can physically go there. They're going to be live streaming them on Facebook, on the sheriff's department's page, and on the CAL FIRE page. As long as you can start letting people know what to expect, where they can get their questions answered, you'll be a step ahead. Effective messaging does three things. In addition to answering those basic questions, if you've done your job properly, you will have been able to frame the situation based on your values. You will provide context for what is happening, and you will be able to have a coherent narrative that people can relate to and therefore adopt. So there's so many examples, but going back to the one that we used with a staff member potentially engaging in fraudulent behavior, that person can get vilified very, very quickly. And if they are found guilty, I guess that's fine. But what if they aren't? You want to let folks know you're aware of the situation, that you've safeguarded the tax dollars that you're responsible for, that you are working with law enforcement to make sure there's a thorough investigation, and that everybody is innocent until proven guilty. That can sometimes pull people away from that knee-jerk, very emotional response. Another example that happened with a client that I was working with was that a student was very angry, posted something on Facebook that could be interpreted as threatening. Weren't sure if that kid was going to take a gun to school. And then that child was outed by parents on social media, and that child was vilified. The child used poor judgment, shouldn't have put what they put on Facebook, but I don't know how many of you ever or spend much time around middle schoolers. Sometimes judgment is not their strong suit. So in that case, when you're developing messaging, it should be about verifying information, recognizing that while safeguarding students, also caring for students who are experiencing mental anguish. I think enough said there. Okay, establishing communication channels. When it comes to establishing communication channels, I referred to this a little bit earlier, but it is incredibly important not to depend on only one communication channel, to really think about your stakeholders, how, where, and when they get information, who they trust, the kinds of messages that will land, and to realize that each communication channel has pros and cons. So when I'm talking about communication channels, I'm referring to the methods that you use. So social media would be a channel, your website would be a channel, email would be a channel, a text message would be a channel, a phone call would be a channel, sending flyers home in backpacks would be a channel. Having one-on-one meetings would be a channel, doing an electronic town hall, or when we get to meet in person again, a town hall meeting would be a channel. Thinking through all of these different channels, doing a formal press release and sending it to the traditional media would be a channel. There are lots and lots of communication channels, and different channels are better for different stakeholders and different situations. So if you're in a crisis, for example, you don't want to depend on a passive communication channel, right? Passive communication channel means people have to come to you to get the information. An example might be your website or your social media platform. It's passive because imagine people wake up in the morning, they have no idea that a crisis is underway. They don't think, I think I'm going to go to the school website and see if there's a crisis brewing, right? You have to reach out to them. You need to use a more active channel, like an email that lands in their inbox, like a text message, like a phone call. Those are active channels versus a passive channel. You also want to think about formal versus informal. So if you're on social media, that's a pretty informal platform, okay? And it's fine to use a little bit more jargon. You don't have to be super formal. If, on the other hand, you plan to write a press release to traditional media, you need to know how to write a press release. Because if you send a press release, let me explain. A press release, you're supposed to have all of the most pertinent information at the top. It's called the inverted pyramid. So in the lead or that first paragraph, you want the who, when, what, why, how, all the essentials right up front. You don't want to build a story and then go for the punchline at the end. Because in the newspaper business, if they get a press release and they don't have room for all of it, they will just cut from the bottom. They assume that it's supposed to be in the inverted pyramid, format. So if you wait and share the punchline at the end, that gets cut first. So you need to understand your communication channels. And maybe the most important thing to remember when it comes to communication channels is that a megaphone isn't always useful. You need two-way communication. So it's fine to broadcast information and sometimes essential to broadcast information, but you also need to be thinking about how to get information back from your stakeholders. How do you listen? How do you find out if your messaging is effective, if people are hearing what you're saying, if they're interpreting it properly? For good or bad, social media is very interactive. So you can certainly get feedback on social media. I even as I say this, you can see I'm cringing a little bit because social media is such, it's a double-edged sword. But it is definitely, if you have an engaged population with social media, you can find out what people are thinking. One of the things that I often share with clients who are reluctant to have much of a social media presence is this. Whether people are saying things to your face, meaning whether they are posting criticism on your Facebook page or not, they're criticizing you. In my book, it's better to understand what those criticisms are and to face them head on than to be unaware and to have them running like wildfire through the social media sphere and not have the opportunity to address these concerns. So it's my 2 cents on using social media as a communication platform. Speaking of not only social media, but certainly social media is a big one here. When you're communicating, especially in a crisis situation where you really need people's attention, it's important to have visually engaging content. And that usually means a picture or even better, a video. You can write the most brilliant prose. You can write the press release to end all press releases, the wittiest social media post. And if it doesn't come with a picture and or a video, people might not engage. So really be cognizant of who you're trying to reach and what will grab their attention. Number 6 is to create a timeline. So in a crisis, there is some information you get to plan, some communication you get to plan, and there's some you don't. When it comes to how you share information, you can determine who you share information with first, second, and third, for example. And this can be incredibly important. So if you have internal audiences, they need to know about information first, much of the time, depending on the type of crisis. Because where do you think the public is going to come to find out about a crisis having to do with your school? People are going to go to their neighbor who happens to be a teacher. People are going to talk to their friend who is a school board member. And if you haven't provided your internal audiences, your internal stakeholders with accurate information, you've really missed an opportunity to get your message out, and you've probably really disrespected those folks. People don't like to feel uninformed. They like to feel valued. And also most folks want to help the organization they work for. So to make your employees read information about their organization on the front page of the newspaper, that's a bad tactic. That's a bad idea. And again, I understand this is not always something you can prevent, but many times, even if you just send out information to your staff an hour before you send it to the public, give them a heads up, provide them with your talking points, your main message points, so that they can speak with authority, they can reinforce your messaging, and they can feel informed and helpful. Number 7, execute the plan. So I know this probably sounds obvious. We just went through the whole plan-ish, and now you do it. I'm a big fan of spreadsheets here because in a crisis, when you're trying to communicate, there are often a lot of moving parts. And so not only do you have to think of all of the different stakeholders and all of the different channels, you need to think who is responsible for which communication. And responsible maybe not only for developing the content, but who has to approve it and who has to hear it first. And which partners do we want to make sure that we're communicating with? Which ones are we doing joint press releases with? Which ones are we just checking in with? Let me give you an example. So when it comes to working with law enforcement, there are times where there's some information they may not want the public to know at different points. And it's best to respect that if you're working in collaboration with law enforcement. So having a big spreadsheet that really outlines each of these things, each stakeholder, each key message, each communication channel, who's responsible, who you're partnering with, who gives final approval. That way you can make sure nothing falls through the cracks. And reviewing key learnings. Your crisis will eventually end. In the middle of it, it may not feel that way, but even COVID-19, I'm knocking on wood, will end. So a post-crisis review can be an invaluable tool. It can help you learn what worked, what didn't, how you can improve. And as I said at the beginning, there is never a time when those learnings are more raw or more emotionally impactful than they are right after a crisis. So do a post-crisis review, make notes about what you can do better next time. I said this at the beginning, I'll say it again now, and I'll probably repeat this daily for the rest of my life for anybody who hasn't done the planning, and that is, oh my gosh, this is so worth the effort. Until a crisis hits, planning for it will never be the most pressing issue. But if you carve time out of your busy schedule to prepare, it is so wise, because as we found out with the pandemic, crises come whether we're ready or not. At this point, I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. And my website is right there. If you would like that workbook or a copy of this presentation, I'll make sure both of them are available. Thank you.